My name is Emily Bell, and I'll be talking about Robert Burns and temporal theory. So temporal theory is the study of time, and Burns was a very famous 18th century poet. Burns had a very multifaceted and sort of complex view of time and the way it worked, and I would argue that that comes from his polysynchronic nature. So basically, there are several ways that people look at time anthropologically or culturally, sociologically, and one of those can be polysynchronic, which is a more fluid perspective of time. It manifests itself in terms of life habits, usually in being able to multitask, being able to sort of mix business with pleasure, which Robert Burns definitely did in the way he wrote his poetry, having sort of a punctual lifestyle, having a more relaxed lifestyle in terms of schedule, which sounds a lot like Burns in the way he planned out his own life. So that may help us understand, in terms of his biographical background, why he had such sort of a loosey-goosey view of time. So in order to talk about temporal theory, we're going to go through a series of binaries from different disciplines. I apologize in advance, I'm not an expert in mathematics or philosophy or Robert Burns, but I thought it might be interesting to discuss all of those in his book. So the first binary we want to go through is a philosophical binary, and the kind of ideas at war here, or at least in conflict or discussion with each other, are cyclical time, so more like a circle, and linear time, more like a line. Pretty obvious. Cyclical time means the idea that time is repetitive, that events in the past repeat themselves, that there's the old folklore idea of the wheel of time. Whereas linear time is a more modern idea, actually, having to do with time, like causality. One event brings another event, that event is different, the event builds on it. The second event, everything kind of lines up in that neat row moving forward. So Burns seemed to have, if not a greater belief in cyclical time, he gave more weight to it. He actually wrote in Cotter's Saturday Night a few famous lines. He said, "In such a society, yet still more, while circling time moves round an eternal sphere." So in the poem, he's talking about this sort of idyllic family and their very simple, happy life. And so he talks about, when he talks about time circling moves around an eternal sphere, that it's almost a preference for that time. He actually acknowledges linear time. In just the next line, he says, "Compared with this, how poor religions pry." So we talk about the family praying, and that's sort of a cyclical event. They pray regularly, and people have prayed through all the time, but sort of organized religion, which is what he argues against in the next stanza, is something that's sort of moved forward, maybe in directions that it shouldn't have. It's an interesting commentary, because a lot of scholars would actually argue that linear time, at least in Western civilization, comes pretty heavily from the Bible, and the idea that it was an account of sort of Hebrews' progress through time and their relationship with their God. And so when he moves religion back into this cyclical environment, it's almost a primitivist or folklorist perspective. We see that idea again of cyclical time, sort of a preference for cyclical time, in his poem Duncan Gray, where he describes time and chance as but as tide. So again, a tide moves back and out, it's repetitive, the same things happen again and again. In this case, he's telling sort of a comic love story, but there's again that sort of idealism of like simple time that moves back and forth, or in circles, repetitive instead of cause and effect, to lead down to a line. So for our second binary, we're going to talk about time from a mathematical perspective. So there's a lot going on in the mathematical community around Burns's time, and one of the big disputes was relational time versus absolute time. And so the two kind of key figures here were Newton and Leibnitz. And so in the Clarke-Leibnitz correspondence, Clarke was the sort of assistant of Newton's. They had a big argument about relational, which is Leibniz's idea, and absolute time. And so absolute time is kind of time as we understand it as its sort of most instinctual level, perhaps. It's the idea that time is, at least in modern society, that time cannot be changed, time does not speed up or slow down, time is an actual existing dimension. So if you have an object, it's two-dimensional, then you have, like length, height, width, and then you have an arrow representing time. And so this object is moving through the flow of time. Absolute time, or relational time, on the other hand, is not so easily explained. There can't really be a diagram for it, so much as a very complicated series of mathematical equations. But the basic idea is that the way time flows, if it flows at all, Kant would argue it doesn't, is completely dependent on the timing, on the person experiencing that time, and the speed that they are moving at. We get more into this in Einsteinian theory as well, where he actually writes out some complicated formulas for relational time. And so Burns seems to be more of a proponent of relational time, again going back to that polysynchronic nature that we can see in his own lifestyle. In a poem called Rigs of Barley, it's actually a song as well, he talks about this sort of, again, idealized peasant situation where the speaker is courting this girl and this wonderful night he spent with her, and he writes that the time flew by with tedless heed till tween the late and early. So the idea is that because the experience of time is having so much pleasure, his time is different for him. It's not even that his perspective of time is different, which is something that Newton could probably accept. It's that time has actually flown by, it's sped up, it's been changed by the state of that object, the state of, in this case, the man courting this beautiful girl. And so, in this sense, Burns seems to be more weighing in on Leibnitz's side of the debate. That's farther supported by another poem he writes, actually. And this one goes biblical. It's interesting because we were talking about earlier biblical ideas being more, maybe perhaps linear, but there are examples that are not the case. And the poem that Burns chose to write about the 90th Psalm is a more definitely relational view of time. So in that poem, he writes that those mighty periods of years which seem so vast appear no more before thy sight than yesterday that's past. And so in this case, he's writing about God's perspective. So again, now we have an extremely fast moving, or like at least constant object, and so the way that object experiences time is going to be different because of the state of that object. In this case, the object is God. And so again, we get Leibniz in that perspective, relational time. Time depends on the object experiencing time. Another nice example of this phenomenon of relational time is found in one of his famous love songs, Red, Red Rose, where he describes how his love is so great for this woman. The speaker in the poem describes how his love is so great for this woman that till all the seas getting dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. So the idea that he will still love her after the rocks melt with the sun. Again, we have this idea that the force of the object so strong, again, speaker of the poem, the admirer, the person who loves, that he can defy time's maybe absolute nature. That time for him is either moving incredibly quickly or he is moving incredibly slowly through it because he has now immortalized himself through his love. So time is, again, relational. It's a condition of his behavior as an object and not on absolute conditions.